It is late in the evening, in the year 2000, and a small green cursor blinks on a computer screen in a quiet house somewhere in the American Midwest. Outside, the world does not yet know what is coming. The internet still hums with dial-up tones. Forums are small rooms, not shouting arenas. People type slowly, thoughtfully, into message boards with names like Time Travel Institute. And they wait, sometimes for hours, for a reply. On this particular night, a reply comes. It begins simply. A short introduction. A username, timetravel_0. And then a claim so strange, so quietly delivered, that at first almost no one notices it at all. I am a soldier, the message says. I come from a year 2036. There is no shouting in the words. No dramatic flourish. Just a flat, almost bureaucratic tone. The tone of a man filling out a form. Not a man trying to convince anyone of anything. He says he has been sent back in time on a military mission. He says his real objective is the year 1975 to retrieve an old IBM computer, the 5100, needed to solve a technical problem far in the future. He says he has stopped here in the year 2000 only briefly. A short visit, a chance, he says, to see his family as they once were, to see himself as a child. Somewhere, a mother reads these words on her screen and frowns. Somewhere, a teenager laughs out loud, alone in his room, certain this is a joke. Somewhere else, a retired engineer leans closer to his monitor and does not laugh at all, because the man calling himself John Titor does not simply make a claim. He answers questions, hundreds of them, over the following months. He describes a timeline, a civil war beginning in the United States in the year 2004, a brief but devastating nuclear exchange in 2015 involving Russia that kills 3 billion people. He describes a fractured, rebuilt America, divided into 5 smaller regions. He describes daily life after collapse, how people grow food, how they travel, how they remember the world before. He is asked about the machine that brought him here. He describes it in careful, almost tender detail. Twin micro-singularities, a housing unit built into the frame of a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, magnetic field sensors, a violet glow that surrounds the vehicle when the unit engages. He posts what he says are photographs. Grainy, ordinary, a garage, a car with strange black boxes bolted where a back seat should be. Skeptics arrive quickly, as skeptics always do. They point out inconsistencies. They demand proof. Titor answers calmly, sometimes with humor, sometimes with a kind of patient resignation, as though he expected disbelief and had made peace with it long before he ever typed his first word. And this is the strange thing that will follow this story for the next quarter century. He never asks anyone to believe him. He never asks for money. He never asks for fame. He answers, he explains, and then, after a few months, he says his mission requires him to move on. In March of the year 2001, the messages stop. No dramatic farewell. No final warning. Just silence, where for months there have been careful, methodical replies. The threads remain online. Copied, archived, argued over, dissected line by strangers who never met, in a way that only the internet makes possible. Tonight, in the hush of that dial-up connection, in the soft light of an old monitor, nobody yet knows how far this story will travel. Nobody knows that 25 years later, people will still be trying to find the man behind the words, or prove that no such man ever existed at all. But that story begins much earlier than the year 2000. It begins with a boy, a family, and a small town where nothing, on the surface, seems strange at all. To understand where a mystery ends, it helps to understand where the people around it began. In the early 1990s, in a modest suburban house in Florida, a family goes about its ordinary life. There's a father who works with computers, careful and methodical, the kind of man who reads manuals cover to cover before touching a new machine. There's a mother who keeps the household steady. There are 2 sons, and among the small routines of that house, homework, dinner, television in the evening, Nothing marks this family as different from 1,000 others nearby. This detail matters because later, when investigators and amateur sleuths begin digging through public records searching for the real identity behind John Titor, it is this ordinary Florida household that keeps surfacing again and again at the center of their suspicion. The family name that appears most often in these investigations is Larson. A father, John Larson. A mother active in local community life. 2 sons, one of whom, some researchers argue, had exactly the kind of technical background, the exact temperament, to construct an elaborate, internally consistent hoax. If hoax it was. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let us stay, for now, in the ordinary years before any of this mattered to anyone. Whoever the man behind the messages truly was, the story he told was not built from nothing. It came from a mind steeped in something specific. The culture of computing in the 1980s and 1990s. This was a world of manuals thick as bricks, of green-on-black terminal screens, of hobbyists who kept obsolete machines running out of pure, stubborn affection. The IBM 5100, the very computer Titor claimed to be retrieving from 1975, was real. It was a genuine, if obscure, piece of computing history. A portable business computer, heavy as a suitcase, valued by a small circle of collectors for a peculiar and little-known feature. It could emulate older IBM mainframe programming languages, a strange bridge between computing eras. Whoever wrote the Titor posts knew this machine intimately. Not in a general way, but in the way of someone who had perhaps handled one, repaired one, or at the very least read every technical document ever published about it. This is one of the small, human touches that made the story feel real to so many readers. Not the grand claims of nuclear war and time machines. Those were dramatic, but distant. It was the specificity of the 5100, the odd little historical fact almost no one else would think to invent, that made careful readers pause and think. Perhaps this person is telling the truth. There's a particular kind of person drawn to forums like the Time Travel Institute in the year 2000. Engineers, physics hobbyists, science fiction readers who wanted their fiction to feel plausible, grounded in real equations rather than magic. It was, in a sense, the perfect audience, skeptical enough to demand detail, technical enough to appreciate detail when it came, and hungry enough for wonder to want quietly for the story to be true. Whoever sat at that keyboard, night after night, understood this audience perfectly. Understood how to answer a hard question just enough to seem credible, without ever fully closing the door on ambiguity. Understood, perhaps above all, patience, the willingness to spend months building a character no one could see, trusting only in words on a screen. Somewhere in that modest Florida house, if the researchers are right, a young man sat at a desk in the evenings, in the particular quiet of a household already asleep, and began to write. We do not know, even now, exactly what he was thinking, whether it began as an experiment, a story, a private joke that grew larger than intended, or something else entirely, something we will return to much later when the pieces of this story are finally laid side by side. For now, it is enough to know this. Before John Titor ever claimed to come from the future, someone, somewhere, sat quietly with a keyboard, a knowledge of old machines, and a story only just beginning to take shape. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a house at midnight, when everyone else is asleep and only one lamp remains lit. It is in this stillness readers of the old forums imagine that the machine was born, not a machine of metal and wire, but a machine of words built sentence by sentence, post by post, with the same patience an engineer might bring to a real piece of hardware. By the time the Titor posts moved from the Time Travel Institute forum to Art Bell's paranormal radio community, and then to a public bulletin board simply called the Post-to-Post Forum, the story had grown a spine. It was no longer a loose collection of claims. It had become an architecture, and the reader was invited to walk through its rooms one at a time. At the center of that architecture sat the machine itself, Titor described it with the calm authority of a man reciting specifications he had memorized long ago, the way a soldier might recite the parts of a rifle. 2 units, he said, of sealed micro-black holes, rotating in opposite directions to stabilize the gravity field between them. A 4-mile safety radius required before activation, though the device itself, he insisted, was small enough to fit inside the frame of a car. Cesium clocks to calculate the exact temporal displacement. A control panel bolted where a back seat used to be, dials and switches salvaged, he said, from surplus military inventory. He posted photographs, grainy, low-resolution images of a stripped-down car interior, dark metal boxes wired together with an almost homemade untidiness. To a physicist, the photographs proved nothing. To an ordinary reader, scrolling late at night, they proved everything. Here was a story that did not simply assert magic. It offered wiring. It offered dials. It offered the comforting texture of something built by hand, in a garage, by someone who clearly loved machines. This was the genius of the hoax, if hoax it was, and by now, most researchers agree that it was. It never asked the reader to abandon logic. It asked the reader to follow logic somewhere unfamiliar. When challenged on the physics, Titor didn't dismiss the question. He answered with more physics. He spoke of Tipler cylinders, gravitational singularities, and a favorite technical work among certain fringe physicists of the era, a paper on the theoretical mechanics of closed time-like curves. He would even, at times, gently correct his questioners, noting an error in their math with a mild condescension of a patient tutor. Among the community, a particular figure emerges again and again in the old archived threads. A man who went by the name Pamela, and another, a moderator using the handle Chuck, both of whom pressed Titor for consistency, hunting for contradictions the way a jeweler hunts for flaws in a stone. Titor rarely lost his composure. When he did stumble, he would sometimes simply say that certain details were restricted, or that the timeline he came from was only one of many possible futures. A multiverse, he explained, branching endlessly with every choice. This idea, the multiverse escape hatch, deserves its own quiet pause because it is one of the most elegant tricks in the entire mystery. If the future Titor described didn't happen exactly as written, he had already given himself the perfect explanation. Every choice creates a new timeline, he said. His act of traveling back and speaking to them had already begun to change the future he came from. In other words, if his predictions failed, that was not proof he was lying. It was proof, within his own logic, that he had succeeded. It is worth sitting with how satisfying this must have felt to a curious, skeptical mind. A story that anticipated its own disproof and turned that disproof into evidence of its truth. Whoever built this narrative understood something rare, that a truly convincing lie is not one without holes, but one whose holes have already been quietly bricked over in advance. And so, night after night, the machine grew. Not the machine bolted into a Corvette, but the machine of belief built collaboratively, unknowingly, by hundreds of strangers typing into the dark. Believers strengthened the story by asking sharper questions. Skeptics strengthened it by attacking and failing to fully dismantle it. Even mockery became, in its own strange way, a kind of maintenance, keeping the story alive, keeping it circulating, keeping new eyes finding it for the first time. Somewhere, in a quiet house, a lamp still burned late into the night. And somewhere else, thousands of miles away, a woman closed her laptop after reading the newest post, unable to say for certain whether she believed a word of it, and unable, just the same, to stop reading. Every ghost story needs a world for its ghost to haunt, and John Titor gave his readers an entire ruined future, described in such patient, methodical detail that it began to feel less like prophecy and more like a travel diary written by someone who had simply, quietly been there. He said the trouble would begin gradually, and then all at once. Political unrest deepening through the early 2000s tension rising between ordinary citizens and their government, until in the year 2004, it broke into open conflict. Not a single dramatic battle, he explained, but something slower and stranger. A civil war spreading unevenly across the United States, some states falling into chaos while others remain calm. A patchwork of order and disorder rather than a single clean front line. He described the causes almost bureaucratically. Economic distress, deep distrust of federal institutions, a widening gap between rural and urban ways of life. He did not describe grand villains or clear heroes. He described the war the way a tired soldier might describe it years later. Confusing, exhausting, without a single clean narrative, the way real wars almost always are and fictional wars almost never are. Then came the detail that unsettled even seasoned skeptics. A nuclear exchange in the year 2015, following the disintegration of the old world order involving Russia and the United States, killing some 3 billion people worldwide. Titor did not linger dramatically on this number. He stated it plainly, almost clinically, the way a man might state a casualty figure from a war fought long before his own birth, already absorbed into history, already numb with distance. He described what followed. Cities abandoned, populations scattered into smaller, self-sufficient communities. The old federal government fractured into 5 regional centers, each with its own local governance, loosely bound by necessity rather than shared ideology. He spoke of rebuilt infrastructure, small-scale, local power generation, community gardens replacing supermarket supply chains, radio replacing much of what the internet once carried. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the 2004 Olympics will be the last held for many years, a detail so oddly specific it lodged in the memory of readers who otherwise cared nothing for prophecy. This is where the human details enter, and where the story becomes, briefly, tender rather than terrifying. Titor spoke of his own childhood in this ruined future, not with despair, but with a strange, calm affection. He described his grandmother teaching him to grow vegetables in a converted lot. He described children in his community learning practical skills early. Farming, basic mechanics, first aid, because a fractured world demanded self-reliance long before adulthood. He described a life that was harder, yes, but not without its own dignity, its own quiet rhythms, its own small comforts. He was asked about disease, about the fate of technology, about whether computers still existed in his world. He said yes, though older machines, sturdier and simpler, were often more valued than newer ones. Vulnerable, he claimed, to certain electromagnetic effects following the exchange. This was, in fact, his stated reason for the entire mission. Retrieving the IBM 5100, a machine his future government needed to verify the compatibility of aging computer systems still running critical infrastructure. It is worth pausing here in the hush of this imagined world to notice something. Titor's future was not glamorous. It offered no flying cars, no gleaming cities, no triumphant technological utopia. It offered ruin, patched carefully back together by ordinary people doing ordinary, difficult work. This, perhaps more than any equation or photograph, is why so many found it strangely convincing. It did not read like a boy's fantasy of the future. It read like an exhausted man's memory of one. And there was one more detail, small and human, that lingered longest in the minds of those who followed the story closely. Titor said that in this future, people looked back on the early 2000s, this very moment, the moment his readers were living in. Not with nostalgia, but with a kind of gentle pity, the way one might look back on a family before it knew the trouble that was coming. He said his own family, in this future, remembered this era, remembered him as a child in it, and that this, more than any military order, was the real reason he had chosen to stop here, briefly, on his longer journey backward through time. It was a war story with no villain, a prophecy with no triumph, a future built not from ambition, but from survival. And it left readers with an odd, lingering discomfort. Not because it was frightening, but because it was strangely, quietly plausible, the kind of future that did not need special effects to feel real. It only needed patience, detail, and a narrator who never once raised his voice. There's a particular kind of tension that builds when a story refuses to fall apart. Skeptics expect contradiction. They wait for it the way a fisherman waits by a still pond, certain that eventually something will surface. With John Titor, the wait grew longer than anyone expected, and that alone became part of the mystery. Physicists on the forums pressed him on the mechanics of his machine, expecting the kind of vague hand-waving comment to science fiction. Instead, Titor responded with citations. He referenced real theoretical work on rotating black holes and closed timeline curves, discussed gravitational singularities with a vocabulary that matched, almost eerily, the language used in obscure academic papers of the era. He was not always right by the standards of working physicists, but he was never simply wrong in the careless way a layman guessing at jargon usually is. His errors, when they occurred, were the errors of someone who had studied deeply but was, perhaps, quietly working just outside his actual expertise, a detail that would later feed directly into theories about who he truly was. One user, a nuclear engineer by trade, spent weeks constructing detailed technical challenges, hoping to catch Titor in an impossible corner. Each time, the answers came back measured, unhurried, occasionally laced with a dry, self-deprecating humor that made him feel less like a machine reciting a script and more like an actual tired young man, mildly amused by how seriously everyone was taking him. Then there were the predictions that seemed, briefly, to land with unsettling precision. Titor mentioned in passing that mad cow disease would become a significant health crisis in the coming years, spreading in ways not yet publicly anticipated. He mentioned the discovery of stem cells with regenerative properties tied to certain diseases. He spoke, almost casually, of civil unrest simmering beneath the surface of American life. Unrest that, years later, some readers would point to and say, "Look, he was right. Something like this did happen, even if not in the exact shape he described." Believers seized on these moments as proof. Skeptics pointed out, patiently, that vague predictions about disease outbreaks and civil unrest were the oldest trick in the prophecy business, broad enough to eventually seem to match almost anything, the way a fortune teller's words bend to fit whatever life brings you afterward. This tension between eerie near misses and comfortable statistical inevitability became one of the great unresolved arguments of the entire saga, one that still surfaces decades later in comment sections and documentary forums. But the most quietly devastating challenge came not from a physicist, but from an ordinary skeptic who simply asked Titor to make a specific, falsifiable prediction with a firm date attached, something that could not later be reinterpreted or explained away by talk of branching timelines. Titor obliged. He predicted the Civil War would begin in earnest in the year 2004. He gave this prediction cleanly, without hedging. The year 2004 came. The year 2004 went. No civil war. No fracturing of the United States into 5 regions. No collapse of the old federal government. The Olympics of that year proceeded in Athens. Unremarkable, unremembered as any kind of historical hinge point. This should have been the end of the story. A clean, falsified prophecy, the kind that quietly kills most doomsday predictions and sends their audiences drifting elsewhere. And for many casual readers, it was the end. Interest faded, the forums grew quieter, new internet fascinations arrived to claim public attention. But for a smaller, more devoted circle, the failure of the prediction did not end the mystery. It deepened it, because by then, Titor himself was long gone from the forums, unable to explain or defend the discrepancy, and his silence left a strange vacuum. Was this proof of a hoax, finally caught in its own trap? Or was it proof of the multiverse theory Titor had described so carefully from the beginning? Evidence that his very presence in the past had already begun altering the timeline he came from, nudging it away from the war he once described. The uncomfortable truth is that both explanations fit the available evidence equally well, and this ambiguity, more than any single clever detail, is what allowed the mystery to survive its own failed prophecy. A story with no easy answer does not die quietly. It lingers, unresolved, in the back of the mind, the way an argument left unfinished keeps replaying itself long after the room has gone quiet. And so, even after the war never came, the questions did not stop. If anything, they multiplied, spreading outward from forums into documentaries, books, and eventually a decades-long hunt for the man, or men, behind the words. By the spring of 2001, the Post had simply stopped. No warning, no dramatic farewell speech, no final proclamation. One day there were replies, careful and unhurried as always. Then there were none. For a story built almost entirely out of words on a screen, this silence became its own kind of evidence, open to whatever interpretation the reader wanted to bring to it. To believers, the silence fit perfectly with everything Titor had said about his mission. He had told them from the beginning that his stay was brief, that he had come only to visit his family and collect the old computer before continuing on to 1975, and then, eventually, home to 2036. A soldier does not linger past his orders. His silence was simply the silence of a man who had finished his errand and moved on, exactly as he said he would. To skeptics, the silence read differently. It looked like the quiet exit of someone who had grown tired of maintaining an elaborate fiction, or who sensed the story was reaching its natural end, its momentum beginning to fade as new questions grew harder to answer without contradiction. A story cannot be sustained forever. Eventually, every storyteller must either escalate the tale beyond what is believable or simply stop talking. What makes this vanishing different from countless other internet mysteries is what happened afterward. Most hoaxes fade when their author disappears. This one did not. If anything, the disappearance acted like a seed left in fertile soil, and what grew from it over the following years surprised almost everyone, including one suspects, whoever had been typing those careful replies in the first place. Archivists began preserving every post, worried that message boards from that era, fragile and prone to disappearing, might vanish along with their host servers. Their instinct was correct. Several of the original forums did eventually go dark, their content lost to time, and it was only because dedicated volunteers had copied and archived the threads that the full record of the Titor post survives today, carefully indexed, cross-referenced, studied like a historical document rather than an internet curiosity. A community of researchers formed, spread across continents, connected only by shared fascination. They cataloged every claim Titor had made, cross-checking them against the IBM 5100's genuine, obscure technical specifications, against real physics papers on closed time-like curves, against public records, searching for any family resembling the one Titor had briefly described. This was not the behavior of people humoring a joke. This was closer to genuine historical scholarship, applied with total sincerity to a subject that, on its surface, sounded like science fiction. A man named Oliver Williams, a British television producer, became one of the most persistent investigators, eventually producing a documentary devoted entirely to tracking down the truth behind the mystery. He interviewed old moderators, contacted physicists, and pursued the Florida family lead with the patience of someone chasing a decades-cold case. He found, as others had, tantalizing threads that never quite tied into a firm knot. A father with technical expertise, a son with the right temperament and interests, public records that fit loosely the biographical hints Titor had scattered through his posts, almost as if daring someone, eventually, to notice them. But nothing ever closed the case entirely. No confession emerged. No definitive proof surfaced linking any single named individual to the keyboard where those messages had been typed, night after night, in the year 2000. Every lead thinned eventually into plausible speculation rather than certainty, and the family most often named never publicly confirmed the connection in any way researchers considered conclusive. This incompleteness, frustrating as it was to some, became, paradoxically, part of what kept the mystery alive so long after its origin. A solved mystery becomes trivia. An unsolved one becomes a kind of permanent question mark, hanging quietly in the corner of internet culture, occasionally rediscovered by a new generation of curious readers who stumble onto the old threads and feel, for the first time, the same strange pull that gripped forum users in the year 2000. Somewhere, perhaps, a man who once called himself John Titor grew older through the same ordinary years the rest of the world lived through. No civil war, no fractured nation, no nuclear exchange, only the slow, quiet passage of an unremarkable timeline. If he ever read the documentaries, the books, the endless forum debates devoted to identifying him, no one has ever confirmed it. If he felt anything watching strangers search for him, that feeling, like so much else in this story, remains locked behind a silence no one has yet managed to open. Every mystery eventually collects its own small community of keepers, people who refuse to let a story fade quietly into internet history. For John Titor, this community grew steadily over 2 decades, made up of an unlikely mixture: retired engineers running their own private analysis of the physics claims, amateur genealogists poring patiently over Florida property records, documentary filmmakers chasing a decades-cold trail, novelists borrowing the shape of the story for their own fiction, and ordinary curious people who simply could not stop thinking about a mystery that refused to offer a clean ending. Among them was a soft-spoken archivist who went by the online handle timetravel_archive, dedicating years of quiet, unpaid effort to preserving every fragment of the original posts across multiple backup sites. This was not idle hobbyism. Servers from that era were fragile. Forums closed without warning, their hosts moving on, their databases quietly deleted. Without this archivist's patience, entire branches of the conversation might have vanished completely, and much of what researchers now study so carefully would exist only as second-hand memory, softened and distorted by 20 years of retelling. Investigators returned again and again to the Larson family of Florida, and the case, while never proven beyond doubt, grew steadily more compelling with each passing year. Researchers noted a household with genuine, verifiable technical sophistication, a father skilled with computers, the kind of quiet expert who might easily have explained, in passing conversation at a family dinner, the strange and specific appeal of a machine like the IBM 5100. A son whose later career, some claim to trace through indirect public records, moved through fields touching on interactive fiction and game design, skills that align unervingly well with someone capable of sustaining a long-form, internally consistent fictional narrative across hundreds of forum replies without ever once losing the thread, without ever contradicting a detail laid down months earlier. Some researchers pointed to something else entirely: a science fiction novel, self-published years after the original posts, credited to a woman associated with the same family, which echoed several plot elements strikingly similar to the Titor story. A soldier moving through time, a ruined and fractured future, a mission built around the retrieval of obsolete but crucial technology. To skeptics, this felt like the closest thing to a smoking gun the mystery would ever produce. Evidence that the entire saga may have begun as a creative writing exercise, perhaps even a family project, that outgrew its original intentions and took on a life no one anticipated. And yet, even this evidence, suggestive as it was, never became confirmation. No family member ever stepped forward publicly to claim authorship in a way researchers consider conclusive. No definitive document surfaced linking a specific individual to that keyboard in that quiet house on that particular night in the year 2000. Every path researchers walked eventually reached the same familiar wall. strong circumstantial suspicion, carefully built over years, but never quite certainty. Meanwhile, the story continued to grow in directions its original author, whoever they were, could hardly have predicted. Playwrights adapted it for the stage, giving Titor a physical body and a voice for the first time. Novelists borrowed its central premise, reshaping the ruined future into new settings entirely. A generation of young internet users, discovering the archived threads decades after they were first written, found themselves drawn into the same careful, patient unraveling that had once captivated the original forum members, experiencing, in real time, the same slow creep of doubt, curiosity, and quiet fascination that had gripped strangers a full generation earlier. There is something worth noticing in this endurance. Most hoaxes, once exposed or simply forgotten, lose their power entirely. They become curiosities, footnotes, occasionally embarrassing reminders of gullibility, filed away and rarely revisited. John Titor never quite settled into that category because the mystery itself refused to resolve cleanly in either direction. It was never fully debunked. It was never fully confirmed. It exists permanently in a strange, suspended space between fiction and possibility, and it is precisely this unresolved quality that has allowed it to be rediscovered again and again by new audiences who bring their own hopes, doubts, and quiet curiosity to an old, patient story that never once raised its voice to be believed. It is late in the evening, and somewhere a small green cursor blinks on a screen, much like it did all those years ago. Only now, the screen belongs to someone new, a young researcher, perhaps scrolling through an archived forum thread for the first time, reading words typed by a stranger in the year 2000, words that promised nuclear war and never delivered it, words that described a machine bolted into the frame of an old Corvette, words that vanished one spring day and never returned. They read slowly, the way all of us once read those first messages from time-travel_0. They pause at the mention of the IBM 5100. They pause again at the quiet, human detail of a grandmother teaching a boy to grow vegetables in a fractured, rebuilt world. They wonder, as so many have wondered before them, whether any of it could possibly be true. And perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Not a name, not a confession, not a final photograph proving anything beyond doubt, but this, the quiet, ongoing act of wondering itself, passed from one curious mind to the next, decade after decade, like a lantern handed down a long, dark hallway. Somewhere, if the researchers are right, an ordinary man lives an ordinary life, having once, briefly, in his youth, given the world an extraordinary story. Whether he meant it as truth or fiction, whether he ever imagined strangers would spend 25 years searching for him, we may never know. The cursor blinks once more. The thread scrolls on, and somewhere in that soft glow, the mystery of John Titor continues exactly as it always has. Not solved, not forgotten, simply, patiently, still waiting to be discovered again.